I don't know any book that has been published in my lifetime that had the impact that Silent Spring had in changing the values and ideals and goals of human beings.
I remember being very struck by the first chapter, I believe it's the first chapter, the silence. Other species could no longer be heard.
The laws that were created because of Carson's work, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, FIFRA, which regulates pesticide, those are the laws that we use today.
And I often sat in my fourth floor window in Washington, D.C., looking out at the Capitol Dome and think, I can't do this alone. I just can't do it. And then I read her book.
Rachel Carson's book started the modern environmental movement.
It was only my years as a government biologist that had taught me about these chemicals. They are non-selective poisons. They had only been used during wartime and for the emergency control of insects. They had never been tested for large-scale agricultural use.
I came through Amherst College I started as a freshman the year after Watson and Crick published their famous paper on the structure of DNA. And so all through my undergraduate and then my graduate years, genetics and the DNA revolution was just percolating, and it was a very exciting moment. I became a fruit fly geneticist, but we were all agog with the molecular analytical techniques that genetics was acquiring. So here I am. I've got my first grown-up job. I'm an assistant professor of genetics at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, ready to launch my career, and Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring. I read Silent Spring, and for me it was just an absolute shock, because as I say, I had thought when we study things in the lab, it's just a miniature part of the real world out there. And if we could study enough things in the lab, we would create everything. And her message was very loud and clear to me. You scientists are clever. Yeah, you can make things like DDT and show that it kills insects. But you forget the lab is not the real world. You know, you do things in a lab in a controlled chamber, and it's a grotesque simplification of the natural world. You may have a few plants, a few insects, some soil, then you spray chemicals and show the insects are killed and the plants are fine. But in the real world, you don't control the light and temperature in the soil. Everything's confined and controlled. In the real world, you've got the seasons and you've got the complexity of so many other things out there, and things happen that we simply cannot anticipate from our studies in the lab. For me, that was just huge. I mean, it seems so obvious, you know. You'd think, well, anybody with common sense would say, you're not duplicating the world in the lab. But that's the conceit of reductionist science, that we think we're reducing the elements to their smallest parts, and that allows us then to multiply up to the big world.
I'm old enough to remember bromides like progress is our middle name, and better living through chemistry, and even DDT is good for me. And the Jetson family that ate little tablets and drank an orange substance that we assumed was Tang, the drink of astronauts. I mean, I remember this vision of food, and that this is where food was going. And I think what we saw over the period of World War II and afterwards was this tremendous separation as our population became more urbanized. And we were all living in cities, and all of our food was being made at a very, very distant place. And what somebody like Rachel Carson did is they broke the distance. She said, you know what? This is what's going on out there. That spraying that looks like, no, this is what's actually happening. This is why the birds are not singing in your backyard. This is why you're getting cancer. This isn't some far distant thing that you don't have to worry about that's doing all these wonderful things. She brought it home. She brought this technology home to people and said, listen, you can't act as if it wasn't there. She broke the distance.
I think that Rachel basically pointed out that there is just so much the environment or our ecosystem can assimilate. It can take just so much trash, it can take just so many chemicals before it can't break them down to natural chemicals, the basic chemicals that they were derived from, and handle the problem.
We realized by the 60s that what was happening is that the DDT was being concentrated in the fatty tissue of the shell glands of birds and in the breasts of women, and hundreds of thousands of times greater than the concentration that was originally sprayed. No scientist could ever have discovered that by looking and studying in the lab. The only way you find that is when it was actually released as a chemical in the real world. And then eagles began to disappear, and then scientists began to say, what's going on with the bird world? Bird watchers realized something was happening. The scientists go out and discover biomagnification in the shell glands of birds. For me, that was a huge shift. I continued on as a scientist, I continued my career, but I could never fool myself into thinking what I was doing was really going to explain the whole world out there, that there was a bigger world. And it dragged me as well as just a